Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the April meeting of the Historical Society of South Australia. I'm delighted to see so many members and guests here this evening. So I'm very delighted to be able to introduce you this evening, or to you this evening, the Director of the Australian War Memorial, Steve Gower. Steve is a Coonawarra red Higgs-eating man, born and bred in Adelaide, educated at Unley High and here at Prince Alfred College. He left school here, attended the Royal Military College Duntroon, and had a long career in the Australian Army, retiring at the rank of Major General. In 1996 he was appointed the Director of the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. I've had the pleasure of going backwards and forwards to Canberra several times a year in the last dozen or so years, and on each of those occasions I've been to the War Memorial as A, to catch up with Steve, and B, to see the wonderful developments that were taking place there. Over those years we've seen such developments as the new aircraft hall, and most recently and most excitingly perhaps is the Anzac Hall pavilion, which has a range of exhibits, which I'm not going to say any more about. It's not my place to talk about those, other than to say that they are very, very exciting. The War Memorial still retains, most importantly, its role as a place of commemoration for those who served their country, and most importantly perhaps for those who gave their lives. So it's my very great pleasure to invite Steve to address you this evening.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for that warm welcome and introduction, David. You talked about succumb to red wine and Haig's chocolate. I think I've only had one red wine from you so far this evening, so I look forward to these other glasses in due course. But look, I'm delighted to come here as a South Australian living in exile in the eastern states, as I think South Australians still call everything to the east. It's been my great privilege to be Director of the Australian War Memorial now for some 8.5 years. It's a wonderful appointment. It's an institution that means a lot to many Australians. And that image, I think, most people associate with Canberra. And I think they associate almost as much as the Parliament House. And the national ceremonies that we conduct, such as the dawn service and the National Anzac Day observance, on Anzac Day, these images are also very well known. We get 15,000 at that dawn service. A lot of young people are coming now. I think they're coming to find out more about what is this Anzac spirit, what motivated these men and women to serve their nation, what were their values. And I think they're coming in increasing numbers to try and apply it to their present day. And 15,000 people gathering in the darkness, and then the light comes up, you're not quite sure with whom you're standing, and then quintessentially Australian, a flock of galahs or sulphur-crested cockatoos come flying across the parade ground. It's quite extraordinary, full of great feeling. And of course the National Anzac Day ceremony at 10:30, that's one attended by the Governor-General, Prime Minister and people like that. You get about 12,000 of that, and that's a very moving occasion. Now, people care passionately about the Australian War Memorial. They really watch it closely, how the staff behave, how we develop the place, and so they should, because the remembrance of Australia's sacrifice in time of war is very important, the feelings and emotions that have been aroused. But people are very proud of the War Memorial. It's a unique national institution. It combines a shrine to the fallen, a commemorative area, a world-class museum. It's also got an archive, which is a great rich source of Australian history in itself. And there's no other place in the world like the Australian War Memorial combining those three elements. The Imperial War Museum certainly doesn't. The Canadian War Museum doesn't. So that's a reason to be proud of the Australian sort of solution to commemoration we have in Canberra. It's got a wonderful collection. At the heart of any museum is a collection with provenance and stories to be told about the collection. We've got 4 million items in our collection, valued at $0.65 billion. They range from a 4-engine bomber, about a half a dozen 2-engine aircraft, submarines, tanks, guns, buttons and bows, photographs, over 1 million photographs, and we've got about 300,000 of those online now. Videos, cine film, and then 30,000 works of art. And the art collection is quite magnificent. Okay, it's got the war theme, or a theme of remembrance, a theme of what the artist's interpretation is of war, but you've got works by people such as Streeton, Lambert, Dyson, Nolan, and to interest you as South Australians, I think we have probably the best collection of Ivor Hills in Australia, and I'll talk more about Ivor later on. And we did have a travelling exhibition of the work of Ivor Hills. Some of you may have seen it at the Art Gallery of South Australia about 5 years ago. But the collection we do have is quite magnificent. It exists to help people understand what their men and women went through defending the nation. We get about 900,000 visitors a year. We've been up to 1 million, but with SARS and terrorism and things like that, it's about 900,000. Most visited cultural institution. We have on our travelling exhibitions about 300,000 people visit those every year. Importantly, over 100,000 school children visit, be it on organised programs, officer-led programs, self-paced tours or whatever, and that's a very important target group, getting young Australians to come to the Australian War Memorial. On our website we get 1.7 million visits a year. And in terms of running the place as a business, it's you've got to run it as a business. In accrual accounting budgetary terms, it's over $100 million, of which over 30 millions you can sort of spend it on projects which the board believe are important in developing the museum. So it's a very big business. I guess some of you in this room would know the origins of the Australian War Memorial. It goes back, of course, to 1915 in Gallipoli. We'd fought, of course, before as a nation. At Federation, we were fighting in South Africa. We had a unit there, the Commonwealth Horse, that was formed to go across there, and their badge, in fact, was a form of Rising Sun badge. But I think our commitment to Gallipoli certainly forged the nation far more than the Act of Federation did, and Billy Hughes certainly thought that as Prime Minister. And when the troops went ashore and the first reports came back to Australia, and I think the first reports were by that journalist from the UK, Ellis Ashmead Bartlett, they were very florid and they were greeted with rapture that Australia had come onto the world stage and was playing an important part in world affairs. And although Gallipoli was a defeat, it really has since played a very important part in our identity. When you think, I don't know how many in this room have gone to Gallipoli, it's quite extraordinary to go there and think all those young men went so far away from home and landed on ancient shore on a peninsula where Alexander the Great had been on a hill and watched his army go east. Xerxes had been on the same hill, watched his army going west. Ancient Troy is nearby, and that was our first really big major conflict. And I think that's a lot of the appeal about Gallipoli. Now, a man who went ashore at that time was a journalist from the Sydney Morning Herald, CEW Bean. He went ashore on day one, stayed virtually for the entire duration of the campaign on Gallipoli, and then stayed with the Australian Imperial Force in its efforts in the Western Front, France and Belgium. And really, Bean was behind the idea of establishing the Australian War Memorial because he was very moved when at Pozières, allegedly, he saw a young Australian soldier dying. And the lad quite poignantly said, "At least in Australia, they will remember us." And Bean thought, well, there's wonderful sentiment, but how will the Australians remember this wonderful service and sacrifice on faraway fields? And that was the first idea, the first thought he had of establishing some sort of museum, some sort of shrine back in Australia. Because at that stage, if you died overseas, you were buried overseas. Now, it's all very well these days to jump on a 747 and go to Europe, but no, it was a major expedition to go in 1915, 16, 17, 18. There's only one body was brought back to Australia in that time. He died overseas. That's apart from the unknown Australian soldier who came back in 1993 as interred in the Australian War Memorial. And that body was Major General Sir William Throsby Bridges. And Bridges was the General Officer commanding the 1st Australian Division. He was killed in action in Gallipoli. And his body was brought back, and his burial place is up behind the Royal Military College Duntroon in Canberra. And he was the first commandant of Duntroon and the first general killed in action, and the government deemed it entirely appropriate that he be buried back in Australia. He was the only one. So, there was nowhere where the rituals of grief and remembrance could be observed. Now, digressing slightly, Bridges came back, and the authorities, they, whoever they are, decided to bring back Sandy, his charger. So Sandy was duly brought back to Australia, came back to Australia too late to participate in the funeral procession, but he was sent out to the Maribyrnong Remount Depot just outside of Melbourne. And there he grazed contentedly as chargers do until he died. And it was always the intention that he be stuffed and mounted and then sent to the Australian War Memorial. But we never have enough money, and we could only afford then apparently to have his head stuffed. And I don't know what happened to the rest of Sandy, but when the box was opened, they found the head and 5 hooves. So I can see why Sandy came back, and I can see why it was a general's horse. But having said that, I was talking to the director of the British Army Museum at Chelsea a couple of years ago, and he was telling me about Marengo, the horse that was allegedly Napoleon's mount. At last count, he said there were 35 hooves of Marengo around the world, including one that is mounted on silver and is placed before the officer of the day mounting the guard at Buckingham Palace when he sits down to have his formal luncheon in the officers' mess, and this hoof comes out. Now, there's some doubt actually whether there was a Marengo, and if there was, whether in fact Napoleon ever rode the beast. But anyway, getting back to the Australian War Memorial. Bean envisaged a place where there'd be a shrine, there'd be a roll of honour listing all the men and women who had died, given their life for the country. He envisaged galleries where the relics of war could be displayed. At this time, the government had commissioned official war artists and photographers. There was people like Hurley, he was taking photographs. And the order had gone out through General Birdwood, who commanded the Australian Corps at that time, to collect artefacts. He had some idea that this place would be an institution where you could go in and have the feeling that here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record they themselves made. A very special place. Where you could understand the sacrifice by commemorating the dead and then seeing what they did and where they served in the galleries. He was able to convince government, and the relics came to Melbourne, just in the Carlton Garden in the Royal Exhibition Building. That was the first Australian War Memorial there. And there were displays, and they packed it all up and moved it up to Sydney, and there were displays there. A design competition was run, but like all architectural design competitions, they couldn't work out who the winner was, and they did it again, and finally they compromised. There was a classical revival designed by an architect, a government architect called John Crust, and one which embodied a lot of Art Deco by a young architect in private practice in Sydney called Emil Soderstein. So what they did, they combined them both together. And if you look at the Australian War Memorial, you can see elements of the Art Deco with artifices on the towers and things like that. On reflection, it was a very good outcome, because as you know, the shrine in Melbourne really dominates the built landscape there in St Kilda Road. That's very much classical revival. Sydney is very much Art Deco. And so I guess in the national capital, you've got this happy coincidence, you've got them both. Up in Sydney, it's interesting, Rainer Hoff, the well-known British sculptor who came to Australia, he did a lot of the work, the sculptural work for the Sydney Memorial. He did, though, produce a work that the Catholic Church claimed to be blasphemous and was not allowed to be put on display. Apparently it had scantily, if not naked, female forms as part of the work. We had a similar thing at the War Memorial in the Hall of Memory. Bowles, the sculptor, had some work in the apse, and Kent Hughes, after the war, he was the appropriate minister or minister responsible, deemed that was irreligious, and the whole thing was taken away and the plans were destroyed, and we've only got just the barest of outline what was planned. I saw nothing irreligious, the sketches I've seen of it, but There has been a tendency down through the ages in public sculpture for ministers to dabble and insert their views. Now, I mentioned Rainer Hoff, of course, in the very nice memorial up there in North Terrace. That's Rainer Hoff is the sculptor there. So there's a link to Adelaide, certainly with the work in the shrine in Sydney. Work progressed very slowly once they picked a design during the Depression. It was not until Remembrance Day 1941 that the Australian War Memorial was opened. Now, I'll just show you a couple of slides of it. That's the construction, and that's the opening by the Prime Minister, John Curtin, and it was opened officially by the Governor-General, Lord Gower. Gower said in his speech that anyone coming to this war memorial would say, never again, we'll never have any more wars. Curtin thought that steadfastness and sacrifice were the cornerstones of society, which probably gives the opportunity to have more wars, provided you are steadfast and prepared to make the sacrifice. But that was the opening. And of course, this memorial to the sacrifice in the Great War, the war to end all wars, was opened 2 years after we were fighting Germany again. And in a few weeks' time, the Pacific was just enveloped by the war against Japan. So since that time, the Australian War Memorial exists to commemorate the service and sacrifices of men and women in all wars. For many years, Canberra had a population of about 30,000 and the War Memorial stood all by itself up there in Limestone Avenue. In fact, when I went to Canberra first, as a young man, got off the train at Canberra railway station, you look straight across the lake and see the War Memorial. Nothing between the railway station and the memorial. But things have changed considerably, of course, since then. In the 80s, it was decided to extend wings on either side. But by the 90s, the council felt that the institution had become run down and tired. And accordingly, it launched a capital appeal, which raised about $8 million. Government matched that. We found another $4 million in the appropriation, and with that started on a program of renewal, which has seen over 60% of our galleries completely redeveloped to the highest standards of museum practice. In addition, we were successful in getting our Centennial Federation grant, which enabled us to build a new building out the back called Anzac Hall. And that hall houses our very large relics like the midget Japanese submarine that got into Sydney Harbour in May 1942, that great Lancaster G for George, and other large technology objects like that. I'll show you some photographs shortly, but in doing a major redevelopment, you have to be guided by some principles. We wanted to restore the Australian War Memorial to the leading edge of museum practice, and that particularly means the use of multimedia in the forms of interactives, experiences, and a technique we pioneered called object theatre, which is the dramatic use of sound, light and image in association with a relic to tell the story. And that's a technique I think is working very well. We wanted to communicate with our visitors effectively, to engage them, to uplift them about this story we're telling. So we conducted quite a lot of evaluations with our visitor demographic. What were they thinking when they came to the Australian War Memorial? What do they want to know about the Australian contribution on the world stage in conflict? And try and respond to them. Also, it was important that anything we put in there was right in terms of our veteran groups. So we conducted quite extensive veteran consultations beforehand. And also, quite unashamedly, we aimed this at young Australians because they're inheriting this heritage. It's important that we are able to communicate with them, so that was a priority audience, young Australians. So I'll quickly run through and show you some photographs of what we've done in the project we've called Gallery Development. And the Australian public has responded very positively to it. In the last 3 years, we've been Australia's #1 major tourist attraction. And you might say, why on earth is a war memorial going into tourism? Well, museums are in the tourism industry. I'm interested in having people come to the war memorial and understand more about what we're endeavouring to communicate. And you go into competitions such as the Tourism Awards, it's very good benchmarking, it's very good continuous improvement, and it gets your name out there, because I want people to come to the place. So, having said that, I'll just show you a few slides and speak to them. That's in the Second World War gallery, Spitfire. You can see the composite use. Spitfire's up in the air. 25-pounder gun is used at the Battle of Alamein. Normal conventional display cases on the side. Now, that might seem nothing to you, but it's interesting. The photograph there is one of the famous ones. That's Sergeant Eyre taking the man who's blinded out in the New Guinea conflict up near Salamoa. The equipment there is the equipment from a commando. He kept this in his shed after serving. It's a wonderful collection, even down to ration packs and things like that. And it's amazing how Australian servicemen and women seem to always want to serve assigned flags as a sort of group dynamic of their experience, and that's one from the Second World War. That's a very sombre sub-gallery. That's Sandakan. 2,000 people, over 2,000 did not survive that death march, and of those, over 175 were South Australians. And one of those men was a captain of this school we're in tonight, Bill Bundy. Now, only 6 survived. And that's a very sombre place to go into. There's photographs of all of them on that wall, and there's a little video from one of the survivors and some rather pathetic relics. That's all we could gather. A very moving area. This is our aircraft hall. We've got a combination of suspending aircraft from the ceiling or lifting them up on pedestals. That's a Japanese Zero aircraft. That aircraft hall talks about air power in the Pacific, 1941 to 1953. You might say that's a funny sort of date range. Well, 41, the Japanese Zero came down, swept all from the sky. It was countered eventually, and the War in the Pacific ended successfully. 5 years later, the Korean War broke out, and we saw helicopters and jets being used in warfare. So that's the theme of what we cover in that particular hall. And that's a Mosquito fighter bomber reconnaissance aircraft. That was the first aircraft we put into this hall. We lifted it up and built. That's up about 15 feet off the ground, and then we've built the displays around it. And it's on a mezzanine, so you can walk up around it and get not only look underneath, but you can look up alongside of it. That's Anzac Hall out the back. Now, it's interesting in the design of Anzac Hall, we didn't want to just reflect the sandstone classic design of the main building, because it would then compete with it. So it unobtrusively slips into the hill behind. And that's a precast sandblasted concrete wall which ends like a ship's bow. And in the wall itself there's long fortification-like slits. So it's very strong architecture, and it's linked by a single bridge to the main building. And you come out in Anzac Hall on a mezzanine. That's another shot of it. So you can see the long sort of slit windows, and the roof itself has an aerofoil section, so in a sense you've got the Navy, Army and Air Force all reflected in the building. I think it's very good design by an Australian architectural firm called Denton Corker Marshall. That's inside Anzac Hall from the mezzanine I mentioned to you. That's the midget submarine, and on the hour there's a show, Sydney Under Attack, how 3 of those submarines got into Sydney Harbour. And I was talking to the Reverend Kyle Waters, used to be chaplain here at Prince Albert College. He was in Sydney that night. Quite extraordinary. As I said to him, that was the time to buy land in Sydney, at Point Piper and Vaucluse and these places. Hindsight's a wonderful instructor. That's the submarine again. And you see that people gather around to watch the show. You watch it from on the floor or up on the mezzanine. That's our first naval victory. That was back in 1914 in November, when the first fleet had left Albany, was heading off to the Middle East. Interesting enough, one of the escort vessels was the Japanese destroyer Ibuki. How times change. We had the Emden as a raider in the Indian Ocean and endeavoured to cut the submarine cable of the Cocos Keeling Islands. The operator there got an SOS out, and HMAS Sydney steamed up to take on the Emden. And after heroic engagement, it sunk the Emden, and it was beached, and there's that famous painting, Emden beached and done for. Captain Glossop was the captain of the Sydney. We've got a gun off the Emden and a gun off the Sydney, and we use object theatre to tell the story of that naval engagement, Australia's first naval victory. And that's that wonderful aircraft, G for George, 90 operations. Now, I guess there'd be some people in this room who have seen G for George flying. I've seen it fly in Adelaide. I was a boy of 4, I think. It flew over Keswick Barracks and down over the suburb I lived in. It's mainly flown by Australians in 460 Squadron, very famous Australian Bomber Command RAF Squadron, and was brought back to Australia for the 3rd victory loan and flew all over Australia. I think for 20 quid, if you paid that, you could have a Flying George. It was left at the Canberra Fairbairn Airport for about 15 years until the War Memorial took it. It was very crudely disassembled. I understand axes and hacksaws were used to pull it apart so it could move into the War Memorial. It was falling apart. There was metal fatigue, corrosion, one of the undercarriage spars had cracked. So we spent $1 million restoring it. It was not on display for 5 years. It was back on display with this object theatre show, and we consulted very widely with the veterans, and they're very happy with the show. And there's 6 cinema grade projectors projecting on those 2 screens, and you've taken through a whole bombing raid over Berlin, which that plane actually went on. The viewing platform out in the middle, that pinky sort of thing you can see, that's you can get up on that platform and view it. You can view it from the mezzanine, and up there you can look back and see the submarine. So sort of getting out into space and seeing the objects in different relief rather than just looking up at them. That's the Hall of Memory. And we had to spend about $2 million on restoring that because there's 6 million glass tesserides or tiles. The sculptor or the designer, that was Napier Waller. He lost his arm in the First World War as an artist. Wonderful uplifting design, but the tiles started to drop off. And if you're in solemn contemplation of loss and suddenly a tile drops on your head, it's not too pleasant. So we had a major heritage restoration of that building. It was reopened by Her Majesty the Queen 3 years ago. And we get the Federation Guard to mount a catafalque on that from time to time. Adds the splendour and the grandeur. It's really a wonderful hall of memory with that domed cupola. It's got a religious feel to it, but there's no overt religious symbology. It's supposed to be a spiritual place, and this quote I gave you here is their spirit in the heart of the land they loved. The stained glass windows give this cathedral feeling, although they honour those who served and those who died in the First World War. The mosaics, which you can see too, on the pendentives, they're for the Second World War. The 4 columns, they were put in 1993 when we had the Tomb of the Unknown Australian Soldier interred. They've had a lot of controversy. Their relationship is to Greek mythology, that in the Greek days you came from water, earth, fire and air, and that's what you went back to. The symbolism is lost on most visitors, and there's been a great debate about whether we should interpret it further or not, but we're just leaving the columns a little bit silent and mysterious currently. But we've had just recently discussions with the architect Peter Tonkin, who was responsible for the Australian War Memorial in London, which was opened or dedicated last year, and Janet Lawrence, who designed that whole setting there. It's a wonderful building. Of course, there's the nominal roles, the roll of honour of all those men and women who have died serving their nation. They're listed by service, Navy, Army, Air Force, by unit, no rank, no decorations and awards. Everyone is equal in death. A wonderful thing has come in about the last 10 years. People come and place a poppy alongside the name. And the name lives on. I think it's wonderful. Old comrades, friends and so on, and they search out, and it was never designed like this. It's just evolved, and I think it's really wonderful. The person is remembered. We also have done sounds a bit pretentious, a sculpture garden on the western side of the main building. That adds another dimension of commemoration. Particularly, we allow ex-service associations to have a plaque installed there. There's been some absolutely wonderful ceremonies of groups coming across, making it their last formal reunion having the plaque dedicated and installed, and they leave knowing that that plaque will be a source of inspiration not only for present Australians but future Australians. One interesting group we had the other day was the Royal Australian Navy Corvettes Association. Now you might have heard in Australia how they were planning a great reunion, and the convener for some reason absconded with the $60,000 that had been contributed. Well, everyone rallied around that group. The Governor-General even came to the dedication. He put on a cocktail party for the men and their spouses and supporters. Someone else paid for a dinner for them all. But they're the sort of functions, and they're really wonderful to meet those men and women who have served their country and are being commemorated in our grounds. And that's another view. Right, well, that's so much for the Australian War Memorial, its origins and where it is today. If you haven't been in recent years, could I suggest you do come across, because I think you'll be agreeably surprised if you haven't been there for about 10 years. Now, I'd like to turn to talking about South Australian associations with the Australian War Memorial. Anyone recognise that man? William Rourke Creswell, in his days as a Vice Admiral. Now, Creswell was not born a South Australian, of course. Born in Gibraltar, his father was assistant postmaster. But he went to the Royal Navy training ship Britannia, became a midshipman, became a lieutenant, went to the Greenwich Naval College. But then at 26 he thought he wasn't getting promoted quickly enough in the Royal Navy and left, came to Australia. Did all sorts of things, went droving, but in 1885 he turned up in Adelaide. And in 1884 we'd just purchased the HMCS Protector, built by Armstrongs, 8-inch gun, 5 6-inch guns and all sorts of other things on the Protector. That was South Australia's only warship. So he became in charge of the Protector as a Lieutenant Commander. And he became very interested in naval affairs and the need in Australia for the colonies to have a naval force. Probably he was motivated by the fact that it would help the Brits out, but nonetheless he spent a lot of time urging that we have a navy. He went to the Boxer Rebellion in 1900 as captain in charge of the Protector, came back, and he became naval officer in charge of the combined Australian Navy, became a rear admiral, and when he was a rear admiral, I think in 1913, suddenly we've got a very big fleet, destroyers, A1, A2. Creswell became a vice admiral after the war and was knighted. Quite an interesting figure. Came from South Australia. His formative period was in South Australia. There he is as an admiral in all his glory. The Royal Australian Naval College is named after him. It's HMAS Creswell. Now, I couldn't find out whether Creswell Gardens is named after him. Now, erudite people in this room, does anyone can help me? Yeah, anyway, I wondered where he's remembered in South Australia. I don't think he is, but he was here and he was actually the father of the Royal Australian Navy, Creswell. I mentioned the Protector. That was an interesting ship, 180 foot long, draft of 12 feet, and very heavily armed. It went to the Boxer Rebellion. It went with the Australian Naval Military Expeditionary Force in 1914 to Rabaul. And that was decommissioned and sold in the Second World War as used by the US Army. And I think a tow line parted, it started to drift, and it's up on Heron Island rusting away. That is a very interesting photograph, that one. That's the SS Aurora, Shackleton, with the Protector. And that's the Protector up in Rabaul. Now, one of Protector's guns used to be on the foreshore at Semaphore, I recall. And then I think in the anti-war period of the 70s and early 80s, it was deemed inappropriate to have relics like that, lest it might lead impressionable youth of Australia or whatever. And I think it now is at Birkenhead, outside the training ship there at Birkenhead. But it's a very significant relic for South Australia. There's not too many vessels, in fact, that have been in 3 conflicts. Now, I really think Protector should be more known in South Australia. Some years ago, I think there was a very small display down at the Port Adelaide I just stumbled across. That's all I know of anyone who's done anything to remember Protector and the men who served on it. It's Lieutenant Commander Goss, George Goss, GC. Goss was born in WA, except he had quite a well-known uncle here, Sir James Goss. His father won a military cross in the First World War, was killed in action in 1918, and young Goss got sent to South Australia, went to St Peter's School Collegiate, or whatever they called it in those days, the Collegiate School of St Peter. He left there and went to the Royal Australian Naval College, graduated well, served on HMS Australia at Canberra. Then he went to England, and it's said in the records that he liked the nightlife rather well in England, and he failed academically, and I think they had to let him go. So he came back to Australia. When the war came, he joined the Royal Australian Volunteer Reserve, and eventually, as an ordinary seaman, and eventually became the mines disposal officer on Her Majesty's Indian ship Hooghly. Apparently he was very good at that, and eventually in 1945 he found himself in mine disposals in Bremen. And the Germans had mines that had actuators, acoustic, magnetic and pressure. And using tools he'd developed, he worked out how to defuse that mine. He did it not only once, he did it a number of times. Very dangerous work in underwater in darkness. They promoted him Lieutenant Commander. I think there are easier ways to become Lieutenant Commander, but he was awarded the George Cross. There he is there, with his wavy Navy badges of rank. He was in the coronation contingent in 1953 and died at Maslin's Beach in, I think, the 31st December 1964. Quite a young man, about 52. But a South Australian, and he spent a lot of his time in South Australia, and his George Cross has been up for sale, but there's a ban on its export. I think it was passed in about $250,000. We don't buy Victoria Crosses or George Crosses. We like to have them bequeathed to us. Hoping that the Royal Australian Naval Association will buy that George Cross and give it to us, because it's quite inspirational what he did. William Charles Nightingale Waite. When I was a boy, he was Mr. Anzac as a colonel. Interesting what he did. Served in 3 wars, actually. Colonel Waite was in the garrison artillery before the First World War. Or correction, the Boer War. He served twice in the Boer War. Became a Lieutenant Intelligence Officer and stayed on over there. He went with the 1st contingent for South Australia, then the 8th contingent, so he missed out on breaking around. He went with the 2nd South Australian Mounted Rifles. He went with the Field Artillery, the 3rd Field Artillery Brigade, to Gallipoli, when I landed on day 1, and on the last day he fired the last shot with the 8th Field Artillery Brigade, and the shell case he fired we have at the Australian War Memorial. He was mentioned dispatches, awarded the Military Cross. Went to France, the Western Front, was awarded a Distinguished Service Order, serving in command of the 24th Field Artillery Brigade. Came back to Australia, was a stock and station auctioneer down at Wollonga, and then came the Second World War. He was a camp commandant, recruiting officer, all sorts of things, and he ended up a Burnside councillor, and there's the Waite Oval at Kensington Gardens named after him. It's Colonel Waite. Led the Anzac Day Parade for many, many years. I sourced that photograph from the Adelaide Advertiser, and I told my secretary, ring up the Advertiser, I'm sure I can remember one photograph in the 50s. Well, there were photographs, I think, every year in the 50s and 60s of Colonel Waite on his police horse. But a wonderful record of service to the nation, and also as a councillor to the local community. The town clerk of the Corporation of the City of Adelaide, WCD Ville, William Charles Douglas Ville. Very interesting man. Must have enlisted as a private soldier, got the Distinguished Conduct Medal, very high award. After that's the Victoria Cross, for putting out the tapes to mark an attack in the First World War. He then won a military cross as an officer at Peronne, and that was a famous action under General Monash, Mont Saint-Quentin. And he laid 2 bridges across, for those who've been there, the Somme, it's very marshy and the Somme wanders around. He laid 2 bridges, his bravery was recognised, Military Cross. He's not a South Australian, he came from Bendigo, but he spent a lot of his time here between the wars with the City Council as an engineer. He was commanding officer of the 2nd 3rd Pioneer Battalion in the Second World War, and in 1941 he found himself up in Darwin as the chief engineer. He was sent in command of Sparrow Force to Timor as the brigadier. Now, I think we all know what happened to Sparrow Force in Timor. The battalion that was there got overwhelmed. Veal and a few others of his staff and the commandos retreated into the hinterland. He stayed there for quite some time using a radio set called Winnie the War Winner, which they put together expediently, and we've got that radio set. At the War Memorial they established communications back to Australia. Veal was taken off in May of 1942 because there was nothing for a brigadier to do. It was really a lieutenant colonel's command. He has quite a distinguished record of service, and he was town clerk for many years. They say he was used militaristic ways with his staff to get things done, but he was very strong on area beautification and gardens and so forth, and there's the Veal Gardens, I think in South Parklands. His name is remembered. And he mixed with the high and mighty. There is General Thomas Albert Blamey, Commander-in-Chief of the Australian Military Forces, on Brigadier Veal's right. The quintessential fighter of the Second World War, a South Australian, Thomas Diver Derrick. Enlisted from Berry in the Riverland, had a bit of a hard upbringing, knockabout sort of bloke, enjoyed his sport. He enlisted in the famous 2nd 48th Battalion, the most decorated AOF battalion in the Second World War. 4 Victoria Crosses, Gurney, Gratwick, Kibby and Diver Derrick. Diver got his at Saddleberg, where he took out 10 machine gun posts, supported by rifle fire from his platoon, up almost an insurmountable slope, and he was awarded the Victoria Cross. But earlier he was at Tobruk, and he got a great reputation there as a person who could take patrols out and engage the enemy, bring back information safely. At Tel Eliza in July 1942 he was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for gallantry, took out 3 machine gun posts and captured 100 enemy. They say at the Battle of Alamein he should have got his first Victoria Cross. But sadly there were 2 others in the battalion that got Victoria Crosses posthumously. Digger. They say he's a very complex man, only quite short, 5'7" I think he was. He liked poetry, collecting butterflies, good knockabout sort of bloke, great leader of men. And that's a very interesting photograph. That's Lieutenant Reg Saunders, the first Aboriginal commissioned officer. And that's the Diver after they'd graduated from the Officer Cadet Training Unit. Diver wanted to go back to his unit, the 2nd 48th. Normally if you never went back as an officer of the unit you serve as a soldier in. But he went back, platoon commander at Tarakan, got killed in action sadly. There is a Derrick Square or garden down at Ethelton, I believe, and I think the Port Adelaide Library has got a portrait of him, but any time I've gone down to see the place is closed or I've been unable to find it. There was a Derrick club up at Woodside many years ago, a club for soldiers, but that's been pulled down in the redevelopment of Woodside. A bit of a shame. He's an inspirational leader of men, Diver Derrick. Brigadier T.C. Eastick. Yes. RSL president here in South Australia for 15 years, chair of the Australia Day Council for 25. There he is leading his men to church in Cairo. Don't think they do that anymore, formal church parades, and the onlookers are watching in amazement probably. He was commanding officer of the 2nd 7th Field Regiment, a very famous artillery regiment of the 9th Division, served at Alamein. He was awarded a Distinguished Service Order for his work there, later a CBE. On his right is Windeyer, later Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of New South Wales and the first commanding officer of the 2nd 48th Battalion, which was raised at Wayville. He took them to the Middle East. The other man's Whitehead, but we don't need to talk about him tonight. Another famous South Australian, Murray Moten. Murray was born in Hawker. His dad was a porter in the South Australian Railways up there. Went all over South Australia with him. Tried to enlist in the First World War, and he was told he had flat feet and some eyesight problem, but he stayed on in the militia between the wars, and at one stage was the commanding officer of the militia 43rd 48th Battalion. He took away the 2nd 27th battalion to the Middle East, and that was another South Australian battalion. And in actions in Timor and Sidon in Syria, was awarded a Distinguished Service Order. Found himself promoted to Brigadier of the 17th Brigade, and that was the brigade that was flown into a place called Wow up in the highlands of New Guinea. The Japs were coming down south from Samoa. They literally got off the planes, fought the Jap, and the wounded were put back on the planes and flown out. Marvellous action he fought as a brigadier, received another Distinguished Service Order. He led the Australian contingent of the Victory Parade in London, but died quite young at 53. And I don't know of any place remembering Murray Moton whatsoever. He went back to work in the Savings Bank of South Australia. One of his sons ended up a Deputy Secretary in Department of Defence and Director General of ASIO 10 years ago. And the other son is a doctor here in South Australia. He had 3 sons, 2 of whom were doctors. 2 of those served with the Australian Army in places like Rwanda, Cambodia and Somalia. And the other son is a major as a helicopter pilot. So a very interesting link with the military. That's the portrait by Geoffrey Mannering, an official war artist. Got a bit of a worried look on his photographs, but certainly a great South Australian soldier. He should be remembered more than he seems to be. Right, Ivor Hill, our longest serving war artist at the Australian War Memorial. Educated here, Prince Alfred College, enlisted in the 2nd 48th Battalion, South Australian Battalion, and General Blamey famously sent for him, appointed him as an official artist and told him he'll go out and paint the bloody war. And I can just imagine Blamey saying that. So off he went, and he went with a Batman and a vehicle. His palette in the Middle East was yellowy ochre, which changed considerably. He subsequently came back and served in New Guinea, and that was a very purpley green and gloomy coloured. I'll just show you a few of his works. This is a very famous one. This is the shambles when the troops came back after the evacuation of Greece and Crete at Alexandria. Big work that one is. In the middle, the man standing is John Dowie. Now, John Dowie didn't go to Greece, things like that, but Hill and Dowie is still alive, I understand, in South Australia. They shared a room or a hotel in Cairo, and Hill apparently used to use Dowie as a model. Now, I mentioned Dowie, just digressing. John's brother is Don, is a doctor down at Wollonga. He came to the War Memorial only last year to view an engine we'd recovered off the sea floor off Malaya, or now Malaysia. He was shot down. First Hudson pilot shot down right at the start of the Second World War with the Japs. And he was captured, did the difficulty and privation of being a prisoner of war. So it's quite an interesting link there. John was the sculptor involved in the artistic interpretation of war. His brother Don was RAF pilot. That's the battlefield burial of NCOs, and that's a very gloomy, hard work that one is. Time he had with the commandos affected Ivor. He didn't recover for quite some time. That's a great work. It looks too small there. It's a very big work. It's the taking of post 11 at Bardia. In the middle, the man being lifted to his feet is Joe Gullett. He was a government whip for many years. And his father was killed in that very tragic air crash outside of Canberra in 1940. It's almost like a crucifixion scene, that is. They've got the timber on an angle and bodies everywhere, great suffering, people trying to help ease the suffering. That was done when Ivor was ensconced down at the house he had at Aldinga, or just inland from Aldinga, where I'm told if you wish to have your portrait done by Ivor, you had to turn up, he wouldn't come and see you. He was sent by the Prime Minister Robert Menzies to Korea as a war artist, and that's some of his work there. And that's his interpretation of another South Australian. Can anyone identify him? Adelaide High School. S.F. Rao, Sid Rao. Quite an interesting story, Sid. He was the Lieutenant General in charge of New Guinea Force when the Japs came down. And with the MacArthur-Blamey imbroglio, MacArthur ordered Blamey to Port Moresby. Sid got upset. Sid got sacked. And they were going to reduce him to colonel, but they reduced him, I think, to major general or something, and then packed him off to England. And I think he had a good time wandering around as a sort of representative of Australia with the British forces. I was talking to Gordon Darling the other night. He was Rao's ADC, and he told me that they'd dined at the Viceroy's Palace in New Delhi and all sorts of exploits like that. Eventually he came back to Australia, and the Labor government promoted him back to Lieutenant General and made him Chief of Army. But it's not a bad work, that one. Rao was an interesting character, very abstemious. It was said of Sid, his problem was that he expected everyone to be saints. And they're not in big demand, or there's not too many saints on the battlefield, unfortunately. And I think he'd be very much disappointed, I'd imagine. But nonetheless, a great South Australian, and he rose to be Chief of General Staff. Stella Bowen, one of our official war artists, only one of 4 women we've had as official war artists. Left Adelaide in 1914, went overseas to learn to paint or develop her career. William Sickett helped her, then she married, I think, a wastrel, Ford Maddox Ford, and had a child, Julie. Mixed in sort of bohemian circles, a lot of the intelligentsia on the continent, but she had left Ford after a while, and her painting suffered, and she picked it up, went to America for a while. But in 1944 she was appointed an official war artist to interpret the service of Bomber Command, essentially, although she also did Coastal Command in the UK. Did some great work there. That's her most famous, Bomber Crew. She did the studies during the day, and that night they all died except one. And she was greatly moved. And you have a look at that work. It's threatening, foreboding work. You've got like an evil bird of prey, the Lancaster, hovering over the men as if to take them away. They look preoccupied, detached. Only one survived. That's a very strong work of commemoration by Stella Bowen. And that's another interesting one. That's bombing up Wing Commander Douglas's Lancaster. Douglas, at 22, was the youngest wing commander in the Royal Australian Air Force. He died at that in January 1945. We had a Stella Bowen travelling exhibition a couple of years ago, and Douglas's brother lives in Albury, and he didn't know that painting existed, so we gave him a couple of reproductions. It's a very strong work. Again, the Lancasters looking very forbidding and malevolent, and yet you've got the softness of the green countryside in the background, sort of a contrast. Stella never came back to Australia, left in 1914. In 1946 she asked one of my predecessors whether the Australian War Memorial would pay to bring her back, and apparently she was peremptorily told, no, you were enlisted in, or you're engaged, commissioned in the UK, and there you will stay, which is a little bit harsh, I guess, because she died the next year in 1947. She occupies a very special place, Stella Bowen, because the body of work we've got of those young men so far away from home, facing death on a daily basis, it's very powerful. For the South Australian. Another South Australian, Sir Han's daughter, well, she hated that, Nora Hyson. She went to New Guinea, and she had a few run-ins, I understand, with the hierarchy up there. She wanted to paint flower arrangements in the officers' messes and so forth, and put in place, or she put, I'm not quite sure who put whom in place, but that's one of her strong works, The Transport Driver. And this is the one I really like. That's Corporal Joan Whip. Now, if Corporal Joan Whip served me up something I didn't want to eat, I'd take it, because I'd hate her to descend on me, I'd have to say, with or without her whip. But that's a very strong work, that is. Corporal Whip was a cook, and she looks the part. And Sybil Craig was the other war artist in the Second World War. She never left Australia, and the other one, Wendy Sharp, she went to East Timor. Now, I've dealt with Navy, I've dealt with Army, I should deal with the Air Force. This is a man from Moonta Mines. His father was a Cornishman and a miner. Richard Williams, the father of the Royal Australian Air Force. Like all successful people, he joined the Army first, and it's good for a laugh. He was in the militia, but he became a permanent member of the army in about 1911 and went to Point Cook on the first course and became the first pilot in the army, because there was no Air Force then. So not surprisingly, he was sent overseas, and he was a captain with the first Australian Flying Corps in the Middle East, as it turns out, in the Iraq area. He did well there. He commanded a wing on the Western Front, received the award of a DSO and an OBE, and came back to Australia as the number one authority on matters aviation. But of course he ran into rivalry from the Navy, who wanted their own Air Force, and of course the Army, when you've got a good thing you don't let it go. The Royal Australian Air Force was formed in 1921, and a few days ago they celebrated the 83rd anniversary. But he was never promoted to Air Vice Marshal to have the same equivalent rank as the other service chiefs till 1935. Very hard taskmaster, I'm told. People feared an inspection by Dickie Williams, and in 1939 they moved him sideways to the UK to broaden his experience. It was alleged there were too many crashes or something in the Air Force, but that was on examination suspicious reason. He never came back to command the Air Force again. He went from London to Washington, retired, joined the board of Qantas Empire Airways as it was then, and received a KBE. That's him in his full regalia as an Air Vice Marshal. It looks a bit like those photographs you see of Sir Philip Game, Governor of New South Wales. But then sanity prevailed. He was a good, genuine Australian Air Force man. But a very eminent Australian, very eminent South Australian, from the Moota Mines area, father of the Royal Australian Air Force. Now it's interesting, the Navy and Air Force had very strong connections with South Australia. Indeed, the men who founded both those services had time in South Australia, were born here. You can't really say the same for the Army. We didn't produce any Monashes, Chevelles, Thomas Albert Blamies. Probably Sid Rao might have got there, but he suffered the difficulty in New Guinea and was sacked. Having said that, we've had a number of Chief of General Staffs from South Australia. The first was a man, I'll just finish on this last note. The first was a man called Major Joseph Gordon. He was appointed in the Permanent Artillery to run Fort Glanville in the 1890s. He subsequently transferred to Victoria and became Chief of General Staff before the outbreak of the First World War. But the interesting thing about Gordon, he really came up with the concept for the Rising Sun Badge. He came up with a design as a trophy of radiating cutlasses and swords off a crown. And he had another South Australian called Frank Bartels do the drawing. And he had this thing made up, went across to Victoria at the turn of the century. And there Major General E.T.H. Hutton saw it, and Hutton had come out from the UK, and he came out to oversee at the behest of the government the integration of all the colonial armies. And Hutton liked this device, and when this Commonwealth horse I mentioned to you was going to the Boer War, Hutton said, hey, that's not a bad idea, let's fiddle with that, and that was the start of the Rising Sun Badge. And there's another connection with South Australia. The shipwright on the HMCS Protector actually made it. So, Gordon was the first Chief of General Staff, Sid Rao, Chief of General Staff eventually. The other one was the man who was South Australia's Governor a few years ago, General Sir Donald Dunstan. So on that note, I think I'll stop there. I hope certainly those South Australian connections have proved very interesting to you. Thank you very much.
Question? Yeah. We usually have questions from the floor, so please feel free. Just speak up if you would, please. Yeah.
Thank you for asking that. You may recall my showing you a slide of the Hall of Memory. The stained glass windows over the entrance in pride of place is a woman, a nursing officer, First World War. The mosaics for the Second World War, Army Navy Air Force, mosaic for women. Now that's quite far-sighted actually when you think of the time. The service of women was recognised in the Second World War, and a lot of women did serve in the various services and different arms. For the new galleries, what we've done is integrate their service, because I think you're making artificial splits by saying we'll have a women's sub-gallery or whatever. We've endeavoured as far as possible to show their contribution where it occurred, where it fell. Except, of course, there were no women in Alamein or Tobruk and that type of thing. It would be sort of specious to try and construct something. But that's how we do it. I mentioned Wendy Sharp went to East Timor. We'd only had a certain number of women war artists beforehand. We thought it was important to send Wendy. You know, she'd won an Archibald Prize. Not that winning an Archibald Prize is a prerequisite to be an official war artist, but you know, Ivor Hill had won 5, and Dargy had won 7, and people like that we've used a lot, and Lewis Miller we used in Iraq, he's won an Archibald. So does that sort of answer it? We try and integrate their service, because I think it's very important to integrate it. Thank you. Yes, there has been quite a lot of discussions. There's, I suppose this sounds very bureaucratic, an interdepartmental committee in Canberra, Foreign Affairs, Defence, one of our curators, looking at what our positions should be. Now, AE2 is not a war grave, it was scuttled. I think it would cost a lot of money to raise it now, and I fear for the conservation process subsequently. The Turks have been a bit ambivalent on it so far. There was a very entrepreneurial person who ran a museum there, was very keen to have it raised, but I think he was keen to have it raised to be part of his museum. I have the feeling discussions aren't proceeding currently. I don't think it's been advanced. I'm not a strong supporter, to be honest. I just think it's best to leave as is. If someone could say dive on it and pull up an artefact, a relic, a propeller blade or whatever, I find that satisfactory. But it's quite big, AE2. Where would you show it? Firstly, could you recover it? Could you then stabilise it? Let's conserve it. And how do you display it subsequently? It's interesting, AE2. AE1 got sunk up near a bow somewhere as part of the Australian Naval Military and Expeditionary Force, and the Protector was the tender for AE1 and AE2 going up there. And the Protector pops up again. I think so. And you wouldn't change it, because I'm against changing things like that, because it was the Napier Waller's conception of designing those stained glass windows. The 3 sets, I think there's chivalrous values, society and something else. And I know some very learned papers have been written by scholars, not only what those things mean, but what the interpretation in the stained glass windows are. I can't remember all the things. Next time I better pop in and see that answer to see one. You know, that's strange. But I wouldn't change it now, because at the time people thought it was very valid. And yeah, I agree with you. Yes, I agree. Oh, okay. And I suppose if he's your legacy garden, you found him very pleasant to get on with, and like what some people say was a bit of a martinet. But there's no doubt he left his impact on the city of Adelaide. My only dealing with him was a young brash lieutenant. I found he disposed of me very quickly. There's only 6 military historians as such in the section, but the core pardon? Yes, there's Australian Defence Force Academy. It's got military historians there, Deakin University. They're scattered around. It's not a popular field of historical endeavour, but it's core business for us, and to the extent that all new staff are obliged to do a military history course soon after joining the permanent staff. I think that's quite important, because unless you understand military history and have some idea of the sequences, the chronology and the importance of various campaigns, actions, Army, Navy, Air Force, I don't think you can serve the public and help the cause of the memorial. So it doesn't matter if you come as a finance clerk or an IT specialist or front of house, you have to do the course. And that's another aspect of the staff. We've got 290 staff. it's very important to have them client-focused, trained, properly oriented, a whole career progression for them. Because curators just don't appear, they're developed over a number of years. The type of person who does understand technology or buttons and bows or regalia, heraldry, you have to train them really. Yes. Remember I said 60% of the galleries have been refurbished? One area which is tremendous importance, hasn't been refurbished, is the Hall of Valour, where we have 60-odd Victoria Crosses. And it's quite inspirational going there and read the stories. And unfortunately at the moment, it's between an area that's been tremendously well refurbished and a central staircase of marble, granite, the same marble as in the commemorative area, satinwood, bronze, and then you walk into this area which is probably 30 years old in design. So that's high on my priority. High on my priority, and depends on the budget, I'd have to say, coming up. If you don't ask, you don't get, but I want to do something about career, Vietnam and peacekeeping. A lot of Australians are very interested in peacekeeping. We've had a lot of men and women involved in peacekeeping, particularly in recent years, but it goes back to 1947 and the Good Officers Commission to Indonesia. We've just, well, it hasn't been announced yet, but we are about to embark on an official history of peacekeeping, because there should be an official record of it. And that's another one of our functions, to produce the official record. Not the last word, but something which is based on an examination of the documents, many of the documents only cabinet documents, departmental documents, and try and come up with an account of our involvement. We're just about to finish Southeast Asian conflict, so there's peacekeeping official history, doing peacekeeping galleries. I want a new building for that though, so there's lots of things to do. When I run out of ideas, I'll certainly have my cards in. Yes, look, there's common respect in the commemorative area. You don't walk into the Hall of Memory with a hat on, shouting, smoking, anything like that. But you have to, in the museum section, subscribe to normal public practices, so how you behave in the Art Gallery of South Australia or the South Australian Museum or whatever. We did for many years employ a lot of ex-corporals and sergeants who gave the wrong image completely, and I've stopped that many years ago. And what we try to have for our, what we call information attendants, our front of house people, try and recruit university graduates in history, people want to be in the place, offer them a career path, and we've got a course for them lasting 18 months now, but by being on the floor interacting with the public, they know what the public expectations are, they learn the galleries, they learn something about what we're doing serving the public, and then hopefully we can offer them a career in curatorial or other specialist areas. But we're three elements: an archive, a museum, commemorative area, shrine. And the sort of rules, you've got to be a little bit careful, you're not too dogmatic on the rules in the museum and the archive. But you have to be respectful in the shrine, really. It goes without saying, because you can upset people so easily if people are disrespectful. Oh, okay. Have you got any artefacts of his? I'm always on the hunt. Huh? Do you? Is that why it sort of parted its tail line and its hair on? Well, I couldn't track anything apart from those photographs. Well, we've got some photographs, but I Oh, okay. Oh, thank you. Mind you, I wouldn't say my research was comprehensive for this. I was doing it at the same time I was trying to run a museum, so yeah, I'd like to have a look at that, because I think it's a very interesting part of our military history, actually, the Protector. Well, there's no problem at all if you present yourself there. If you can't present yourself there, we can give you a panel of researchers. But simple things will help you, naturally enough. And as much information as possible we're trying to digitise and put on our internet site. Things like all of Bean's histories are digitised now and available. Nominal rolls we're trying to put on, embarkation rolls, so that you can do a lot of your research from afar, and then if you need to come to Canberra to see a specific document, we've got rooms there and the facilities and staff to help people like that. There'd be 30 people there every day, rifling through the stacks and whatever, looking through documents. So we encourage that. I think it's a fundamental part of dissemination of information, access to the public.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've had a marvellous treat this evening. Steve, it always falls to me to give the vote of thanks, and it's something I do with fear and trepidation as the meeting progresses. I write notes and I think of things I have to say, and it never seems to come together. I think tonight the penny finally dropped, and that is the word pride. And we can be proud of so many things. We can be proud that those people all those years ago, Bean and others, had the foresight to ensure that our military history was preserved, the contribution of Australian men and women would be recognised and remembered, and that has remained. I think we can be proud of the fact that the War Memorial does such a stunning job in telling those stories, and that the development work there has ensured its place as not only a top destination for visitors, but a place of remembrance, a place where people can undertake that important role of studying what their forebears did in the service of their country. You gave us a great sense of pride in the War Memorial as an establishment. You also gave us a great sense of pride as South Australians in the contribution that South Australians have made to this country in the theatres of war since the very early days of our country. And I'm very, very grateful that you put the time into your presentation, that you were able to take the time to come and speak with us this evening, and I think it's very much appreciated.